It happens quietly. Nobody notices at the start. You're 8 years old, sitting at the dinner table while your parents argue about bills that just won't add up. Maybe it's the tension hanging in the air. Maybe it's the heavy silence that follows the yelling. Or maybe it's just that primal fear that everything could come crashing down any second. And without you even realizing it, something ancient takes root in your chest. If I'm not useful, maybe I don't deserve to be here. This is the invisible origin of one of the deepest wounds of modernity. The child who learns to earn love before receiving it. The child who discovers that their existence needs to be justified through productivity, usefulness, service. And Max Weber, the German sociologist who devoted his life to understanding the invisible structures that shape our collective psyche, pinpointed exactly when and how it started. It wasn't some historical accident. It was a deliberate cultural transformation that still today dictates how you relate to yourself, to work, to love, and to your own dignity. Weber called it the Protestant work ethic, but what he was really describing was something much darker. The historical moment when humanity started confusing human worth with economic productivity. Before the 16th century, kids were seen in a totally different way. They weren't idealized or perfect, but they also weren't judged by what they produced. They existed within a community framework where belonging didn't depend on individual merit. Medieval society, with all its problems and injustices, ran on a logic of predetermined roles. You were born into a family, a class, a community, and your place was secure not because of what you did, but simply because you existed within that structure. Kids grew up watching, imitating, gradually joining in adult life, but without the burden of proving their value. They just were. And Weber realized that changed radically with the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther nailed his theses to the church door in 1517, he wasn't just challenging the sale of indulgences. He was kicking off a psychological revolution that would completely redefine what it means to be human. Luther, and later John Calvin, introduced a concept that sounds abstract theologically but is devastating psychologically: the doctrine of predestination. The idea was simple and terrifying. God already decided before you were even born whether you'd be saved or damned. Nothing you do can change it. Your faith doesn't guarantee salvation. Your good deeds don't buy you heaven. It's all predetermined, and you don't know the verdict. Now imagine the psychological weight of that. You live in an era where the afterlife isn't a metaphor. It's concrete reality. Hell isn't a psychological state. It's a literal destination. And you're not sure if you'll be saved. No sacrament guarantees it. No priest can intercede. No ritual protects you. You're alone before a God who's already judged you but hasn't revealed the judgment. Weber described this anxiety as the transcendental loneliness of the Calvinist, an unprecedented existential anguish in human history. And from this anguish was born the modern compulsion to work. Because Protestants, unable to bear this paralyzing uncertainty, came up with a clever psychological workaround. If we can't know for sure if we're elect, we can look for signs of election. And what would be the most reliable sign that God chose you? Material success, prosperity, relentless productivity. The logic went like this: if you work hard, live with discipline, accumulate wealth not to blow it on luxuries but to reinvest it in more work, then maybe, just maybe, you're one of the chosen. Work stopped being just a means of survival and became a spiritual thermometer. Your ability to produce became evidence of divine grace. And so, for the first time in history, being useful became more important than simply being. Weber called it intramundane asceticism. You no longer had to retreat to a monastery to prove your devotion. The secular world became the stage where you demonstrated your worth to God through methodical, disciplined, ceaseless work. And that changed everything. It changed how people organized their time, how they raised their kids, the very structure of Western consciousness. Because if work is a sign of salvation, then teaching a child to work isn't just practical education, it's spiritual salvation. The idle child isn't just unproductive, they're spiritually suspect. The kid who plays too much, dreams too much, exists too much without producing, is squandering the chance to prove their divine election. And here's the brutal paradox Weber identified. Protestants created modernity by turning work into a sacred calling, but in doing so, they also created modern neurosis. Because once you learn that your worth depends on what you produce, you can never stop producing. There's no true rest, no permanent satisfaction. You're always proving, always justifying, always chasing signs that you deserve to exist. And this doesn't stay confined to the religious sphere. Even after religion loses its cultural grip, the psychological structure lingers. Weber called it the iron cage. The institutions we created to free us end up imprisoning us. The Protestant work ethic secularized, but it didn't vanish. It seeped into every aspect of modern life. It's in how we educate kids, how we measure success, how you feel when you're not producing anything. Think about how this shows up today. A 5-year-old is already being prepped for competition, not just playing, but building skills. Not just existing, but building a resume. Extracurriculars aren't for fun, they're investments in the future. Grades don't measure learning, they measure market value. And parents, even those who consciously reject this logic, feel the crushing pressure to prepare their kids for a world where usefulness is a prerequisite for dignity. When a child brings home a report card with average grades, the anxiety the parents feel isn't just about education. It's a deeper, almost spiritual anxiety about whether this kid will have enough value to be accepted by the world. That's the psychological legacy of Calvinism, secularized, but no less powerful. Weber observed that in Protestant societies, especially in North America, this ethic reached its purest form. Benjamin Franklin, with his sayings about time being money and credit being power, became the secular prophet of productivity. Wasted time is sin. Ungained money is lost opportunity. Life becomes a non-stop exercise in optimization, efficiency, accumulation. And kids absorb it not through sermons, but through the atmosphere. They feel their parents' anxiety when they're not being productive. They sense the pride that comes not from who they are but from what they achieve. They learn, without anyone having to say it outright, that love is conditional, not on words, but on results. And that creates a profound dissociation, because there's a fundamental difference between being loved for who you are and being valued for what you do. The first builds ontological security. You can fail, mess up, not be the best, and your place in the world is still secure. The second breeds chronic anxiety. You're always one failure away from losing your right to belong. And when kids grow up learning the second option, they become adults who don't know how to rest. Adults who feel guilty for taking vacations. Adults who measure their own worth by a packed schedule, salary, tracked productivity. Adults who, even when they achieve the success they chased, find it doesn't bring the promised peace. Because peace was never the real goal. The goal was proving worth, and that proof is never conclusive. Weber was fascinated by this phenomenon because he suffered from it himself. His biography reveals a man tormented by nervous breakdowns, periods of psychological paralysis where he couldn't work, followed by frenzied bursts of productivity. He knew the cage he described intimately. He knew what it was like to feel his existence only made sense when he was producing knowledge, writing, researching, contributing. And in moments when he couldn't produce, he felt not just unproductive, but illegitimate, as if his inability to work was proof he didn't deserve to exist. This wasn't just sociological theory for Weber. It was autobiography disguised as cultural analysis. But here's something Weber understood that needs to be reclaimed. This system isn't natural. It's not inevitable. It's a specific historical construction that emerged at a particular time for particular reasons. Before Protestantism, other cultures organized the relationship between work and worth in completely different ways. Indigenous societies often value being overdoing. Eastern contemplative traditions cultivate stillness as the supreme virtue. Even in medieval Europe itself, there were different rhythms, where religious festivals created mandatory breaks from work, where idleness wasn't sin but a natural part of the human cycle. What Weber was describing wasn't the universal human condition, but the modern Western human condition. And if it was built, it can be deconstructed. But deconstructing it requires first recognizing what was built. You have to realize that when you feel guilty for not producing, you're not hearing your own voice. You're hearing echoes of 16th century Calvinist preachers trying to resolve their own theological anxiety. When you feel like you need to justify your worth through achievements, you're not responding to reality. You're responding to a cultural fiction that's become so pervasive it feels natural. And when you raise a child to earn love through grades, trophies, accomplishments, you're not preparing them for life. You're perpetuating a 400-year-old neurosis. Weber believed that understanding these structures was the first step toward some form of freedom. Not that we could completely escape the iron cage, but maybe we could at least see the bars. And in seeing them, create small spaces of resistance. Moments where existing is enough. Where productivity isn't demanded. Where a child can just be a child without it representing moral failure or wasted potential. These spaces are rare in modernity, but they're essential. They're the only places where it's still possible to learn that you have intrinsic worth, not because you produce something, but because you exist. And there are signs, fragile but real, that something is shifting. There's a growing movement questioning the overwork culture. There are parents consciously trying to create environments where kids can fail without losing love. There are adults in therapy, unlearning the equation between productivity and dignity. There are communities experimenting with universal basic income, testing the radical idea that people deserve to survive even without constantly proving economic usefulness. These are imperfect, incomplete attempts to imagine life after the Protestant work ethic. But they're necessary attempts because the alternative is to keep living in an anxiety that never ends, proving a worth that should never have been questioned. Weber wasn't optimistic about these possibilities. He saw modern rationalization as a relentless process that turned everything into calculation, efficiency, instrumentality. He feared we were creating a world of specialists without spirit and sensualists without heart. People technically competent but spiritually empty. A world where everything has a price but nothing has value. Where everything can be measured but nothing can be truly appreciated. And at the center of this tragedy is the child who learns too early that their right to be loved depends on their ability to be useful. You still feel it today, don't you? When you're lying in bed at night and your mind automatically starts reviewing what you produced that day, calculating if it was enough, if you deserve to rest. When you watch a child playing and feel this weird urge to turn that play into learning, skill building, something productive. When you catch yourself unable to just be, always needing to do, create, contribute, optimize. These aren't personal flaws. They're cultural symptoms. They're the invisible marks of a religious revolution that happened 500 years ago, but still governs how you experience every moment of your day. If you're hearing this and it hits home, ask yourself, when was the last time you felt worthy of love without having to do anything to earn it? When was the last time you let a child just exist in your presence without evaluating, measuring, prepping for the future? If you struggled to answer those questions, you're not alone. Millions of people today live unable to access what should be the most basic right, the right to exist without justification. And maybe you recognize yourself in another layer of this pain. Maybe you were the child who learned too early to be useful, who picked up, through subtle cues or explicit messages, that love was something to be earned through behavior, grades, achievements. Who became the perfect kid, the star student, the dedicated employee, always proving, always justifying, always carrying the invisible weight of deserving your place in the world. And maybe, just maybe, you're now raising your own kids and feeling the terror of realizing that, without meaning to, you're passing on the same wound. Because deep down, you know unconditional love is what every child needs, but you also carry the Protestant legacy that insists worth has to be demonstrated. If you're feeling a tightness in your chest right now, if you're seeing your own story in these words, do something for me. Go down to the comments and write, I too learned to be useful before learning to be loved. Not because it'll fix the pain, but because there are thousands of people watching this right now, feeling exactly the same, believing they're the only ones. Your courage in naming it could be the permission another person needs to start healing. We're all products of the same iron cage, but together we can at least recognize the bars. Weber identified 3 stages in this historical transformation that brought us here. The first stage was theological anxiety. Calvinists tormented by uncertainty about salvation, desperately seeking signs of divine election. The second stage was systematic discipline. Work became not just economic activity but spiritual practice, evidence of grace, a thermometer of worth. And the third stage, the most dangerous, was the secularization of the structure. Even after religious belief lost its hold, the psychological compulsion remained. You don't need to believe in God anymore to feel like you have to prove your worth through productivity. The theology evaporated, but the neurosis stayed. And that explains why so many people today, even without any religious background, feel guilty when they're not being productive. Why taking a day off feels morally suspect. Why watching TV without multitasking sounds like waste. Why there's this relentless inner voice insisting, you could be doing something more useful. That voice isn't yours. It's cultural inheritance. It's the Protestant work ethic operating at a level so deep it feels like human nature, when really it's just embodied history. Weber spent years studying other cultures to test his hypothesis. He analyzed China, India, the Islamic world, trying to understand why modern capitalism emerged specifically in Protestant Europe and not in other equally sophisticated civilizations. And what he found confirmed his theory. It wasn't intelligence, not technology, not natural resources. It was a specific psychological structure that turned work into a sacred calling and productivity into a moral virtue. Other cultures had trade, markets, wealth, but they didn't have this inner compulsion to work as proof of existential worth. That was a singular invention of ascetic Protestantism, and it created the spirit of capitalism. But here's a paradox Weber found fascinating and terrifying. Modern capitalism no longer needs that religious justification to function. At the beginning, people worked relentlessly because they believed they were serving God. Now people work relentlessly because the system just demands it. You have to work to pay bills, maintain status, not fall behind. The motivation shifted from theological to economic, but the compulsion is identical. The cage no longer needs to be justified by promises of salvation. It self-perpetuates through the simple need to survive inside it. And kids absorb this not through religious doctrine, but through the material structure of modern life. They see exhausted parents coming home too late, too tired, too stressed. They hear talks about money, bills, work pressure. They feel the anxiety that permeates the home when the economy's shaky or a job's at risk. And they learn, without anyone explicitly teaching it, that life is fundamentally about work, about producing, about proving you deserve the resources to keep existing. They learn that love might be expressed in affectionate words, but it's demonstrated through economic sacrifice. Dad loves you, so he works 60 hours a week to pay for your school. Mom loves you, so she gives up her own dreams to secure your future. Love becomes synonymous with material provision, and material provision demands ceaseless work. Weber would call this the disenchantment of the world. Once life loses its sacred dimension and becomes just resource management, efficiency, calculation, optimization, something essential dies. The child growing up in this world never experiences true enchantment. They never know the luxury of existing without purpose, playing without goal, simply being without justification. Everything has to have a reason. Every activity has to build some skill. Every free moment is wasted potential. And so, generation after generation, we create adults who are technically competent but spiritually starved, able to produce anything except meaning, able to conquer anything except peace. But there's something Weber saw that offers a thread of hope, however fragile. He realized cultural systems aren't monolithic. There are always cracks, contradictions, spaces where other possibilities emerge. Even at the height of Protestant capitalism, there were always people who resisted. Artists who refused to reduce creation to productivity. Contemplatives who insisted being is more important than doing. Rebels who simply said no to the iron cage and paid the social price for it. These people didn't transform the system, but they kept alive the memory that other ways of life are possible. And maybe that's the task today. Not waiting for a revolution that topples the whole structure, but creating small, daily rebellions. Little acts of resistance where you decide your daughter can spend the whole afternoon doing absolutely nothing productive, and that doesn't make you a failure as a mom. Where you allow yourself a week of vacation without checking work email and don't see it as weakness. Where you look at a child and see intrinsic worth, not potential to be developed. These small rebellions don't feel revolutionary, but they are. Because every time you break the equation between usefulness and dignity, you're creating a crack in the cage. And cracks add up. Weber didn't live to see how far this logic would go. He died in 1920, before the full explosion of the productivity culture that defines the 21st century, before smartphones that turn every moment into a work opportunity, before the gig economy that commodifies even hobbies, before social media that turns personal life into measurable performance. But he predicted the direction. He knew that once you teach a generation that human worth is a function of economic utility, there's no natural limit to where that logic can go. It expands into every domain of existence until nothing is left unmeasured, unoptimized, unmonetized. And the kids of today are growing up in a version of this reality Weber couldn't have imagined. Kids whose first contacts are with algorithms designed to turn attention into profit. Kids whose brains are trained from early on to respond to social approval metrics through likes and views. Kids who see influencers turning every aspect of life, including childhood, into consumable content. The logic is the same one Weber identified, just technologically amplified. You don't just exist, you produce content. You don't live experiences, you document them for public consumption. You don't have intrinsic worth, you have market value based on measurable engagement. Think about how this plays out concretely. A 12-year-old today is constantly calculating how their life looks to others. Every photo, every post, every story is a performance of success, happiness, relevance. And behind that performance is the same anxiety that tormented Calvinists. Am I chosen? Do I deserve to exist in this space? And the answer comes in the form of metrics. How many likes? How many comments? How many people validated me? It's the same logic of seeking signs of divine election, just secularized and gamified. And when the signs don't come, when the post doesn't perform, when the validation is insufficient, what the child feels isn't just disappointment. It's existential anxiety about their own worth. Weber would have recognized this right away. It's the Protestant work ethic on digital steroids, and the psychological consequences are exactly what he feared. Kids developing anxiety and depression at unprecedented rates. Young adults burning out before 30. A whole generation that doesn't know how to rest, doesn't know how to just be, doesn't know how to exist outside the imperative to produce, perform, prove. And the most tragic part is that it's normalized. It's treated like it's just modern life, like there's no alternative, like it's always been this way. But it hasn't always been this way. There was a time, not so long ago, when kids could disappear for a whole afternoon playing unsupervised without goal, without anyone documenting or optimizing the experience. There was a time when you could have a bad day without it becoming public performance. There was a time when your life didn't have to be a constant resume. And maybe, just maybe, it's possible to create pockets of resistance where kids can still experience that. Not as romantic nostalgia for a past that never existed, but as a conscious refusal to sacrifice childhood on the altar of productivity. That takes something Weber saw as increasingly rare in modernity: the courage to seem unproductive, the courage to let your kid be average at something without immediately hunting for tutors, extra training, acceleration programs, the courage to have empty spaces in the family schedule that aren't filled with structured activities, the courage to say no. Your daughter isn't learning Mandarin at 5 because that's not development. It's projected anxiety. That courage isn't easy because you're swimming against the entire cultural current. You're resisting not just external pressures, but your own inner voices shaped by the same logic you're trying to challenge. And here's another paradox Weber would understand perfectly. To truly free a child from the compulsion to prove worth through utility, you first have to free yourself from that compulsion. But if you were raised inside the iron cage, if you internalize the equation between productivity and dignity, how can you teach something different? How can you offer unconditional love when you never received unconditional love yourself? How can you create space to just be when you don't know how to just be? The answer isn't comfortable, but it's honest. You're probably going to fail at this a lot. You're going to try to parent differently and catch yourself reproducing the same patterns. You're going to promise your daughter she doesn't need to be perfect, and then feel disappointed when she brings home a low grade. You're going to talk about unconditional love, and then unconsciously withhold affection when she doesn't meet your expectations. That's not hypocrisy. It's inheritance. It's 500 years of cultural conditioning operating through you. But recognizing it is the first step, because when you can see the structure, When you can name where this compulsion comes from, you create a little distance between you and it, and in that distance lives the possibility of choice. Weber believed consciousness doesn't guarantee freedom, but it makes freedom possible. As long as you think your reactions are natural, inevitable, just how things are, you're completely captured by them. But when you understand that your reactions are products of a specific history, of a cultural transformation that could have gone differently, something shifts. You'll still feel the compulsion, but you'll know you don't have to obey it. You'll still hear the voice saying, you need to prove your worth, but you'll recognize it's not your voice. It's the echo of long-dead Calvinist preachers, and you can choose not to believe them. That choice is especially crucial when you're raising kids, because every time you manage to offer love that doesn't depend on performance, you're planting something revolutionary in their psyche. You're offering them an experience of unconditional dignity, and that experience, no matter how brief or imperfect, creates memory in the body. It creates an internal reference that there's another way to be in the world. And when that child grows up and faces the pressures of productivity culture, they'll have something to contrast it with. They'll be able to say, I know the world tells me I only matter for what I produce, but I had a different experience once, and I know that's not absolute truth. Weber spent the last years of his life tormented by the question, is it possible to live with meaning inside the iron cage? Or are we doomed to choose between illusion and despair? Between believing in fictions that no longer hold or facing the emptiness of a completely disenchanted world? He never found a satisfying answer. But maybe the question was framed wrong. Maybe it's not about completely escaping the cage or finding cosmic meaning that justifies everything. Maybe it's about finding small moments of enchantment within the disenchanted structure. Moments where you experience worth that doesn't need proving. Where you live connection that doesn't need to be useful. Where you simply exist and that's enough. For kids, these moments are more accessible because they haven't fully internalized modernity's instrumental logic yet. They still know how to play without purpose. They can still get lost in activities that produce nothing but joy. They still feel wonder at things adults find mundane. But that capacity is systematically eroded by modern education, productivity culture, the constant insistence that everything needs measurable purpose. And when that erosion is complete, you have an adult perfectly adapted to modern capitalism, but completely alienated from their own humanity. So maybe the work isn't teaching kids something new. Maybe it's protecting something they already have, protecting the capacity for enchantment before it's destroyed by rationalization, protecting the experience of intrinsic worth before it's replaced by instrumental value, protecting the right to exist without justification before it's conditioned on proven merit. That doesn't mean not educating, not preparing for reality, not building skills. It means doing all that without destroying the core of unconditional dignity that should be the foundation of everything. Weber wasn't optimistic about our chances of succeeding at this. He saw historical forces as far greater than individual choices. He understood that you can create small spaces of resistance in your home, but your kids will still grow up in a broader culture that insists on the equation between utility and worth. They'll encounter teachers who measure everything, employers who value only productivity, romantic partners shaped by the same logic. How do you protect someone from an entire culture? The honest answer is, you can't protect them completely, but you can equip them. You can offer experiences and language that let them question what the culture takes as natural. You can show there's a difference between being useful and having worth. You can model, however imperfectly, a life not reduced to just work and achievements. And most importantly, you can name the wound. You can say, I know out there you're learning you have to prove you deserve love. But that's not true. You deserve love simply because you exist. And I'll keep reminding you of that even when you forget. That constant reminder is crucial because the culture is constantly sending the opposite message. Every ad, every school structure, every success metric is saying, you need to do more, be more, produce more to finally be enough. And against that relentless message, your single voice might seem insignificant, but it's not, because you're not just offering a different opinion. You're offering lived experience of unconditional love. And experience is more powerful than ideology. Weber understood the power of lived experience. He knew theories change minds, but practices change bodies. And it's at the body level, not the intellectual, that the iron cage operates. It's your stomach that knots when you're not being productive. It's your chest that tightens when you feel you've let someone down. It's your entire nervous system trained to respond to signals of success and failure, like life or death matters. So offering a different experience at the bodily level is offering potential reprogramming. It's letting a child's body experience security that doesn't depend on performance. And that embodied experience can create a foundation that sustains them even when the external world is hostile. That's no guarantee. Some kids will internalize the cultural logic anyway. Some will reject your unconditional love because it feels so different from what they see everywhere. Some will even resent you for not preparing them adequately for the brutal competition ahead. Parenting inside the iron cage has no perfect solutions. You're always negotiating between shielding your child from a violent world and preparing them to survive it, between preserving their humanity and ensuring their economic viability, between the love you'd like to give and the love you can actually embody given your own limitations. Weber would call this the tragedy of modernity. There are no pure choices. Everything is compromise. You can try to parent differently, but you're still parenting within a structure that severely limits your options. You can offer unconditional love, but your kids will still live in a world that demands constant performance. You can teach intrinsic dignity, but they'll still need to work to survive in a system that values only utility. So you do the best you can, knowing your best is necessarily inadequate. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Not to solve the problem, but to keep alive the awareness that the problem exists. Because the alternative is worse. The alternative is just accepting the dominant logic without question. Raising your kids to be perfectly adapted to the cage without ever mentioning the cage exists. Reproducing the wound unconsciously. Passing on intergenerational trauma without naming it. Perpetuating a system that destroys humanity in the name of efficiency. And if you're still here listening to this, you've already shown you don't want to do that. You want something different, even if you don't know exactly what or how. That wanting is the beginning. Weber would say it's the ethical impulse that precedes and enables any real social change. Before structures shift, individuals need to want them to shift. They need to feel something's wrong. They need to refuse what's presented as inevitable. And every person who does that creates a small crack in the system's apparent totality. It doesn't topple the system, but it keeps open the possibility that the system could be different. So if you're a mom, dad, teacher, anyone with influence over how kids learn to relate to the world, you have power. Not the power to transform the whole culture alone, but the power to create a different microclimate where the kids in your care can experience alternatives, where they can learn that existing is enough before learning they need to prove utility, where they can be loved unconditionally before being trained conditionally. That microclimate won't shield them from all external pressures, but it'll give them an internal reference that many adults today lack. And if you don't have kids in your care, you still have the child you were, the child who learned too early that love was conditional, who internalized the equation between utility and worth, who carries to this day the compulsion to prove they deserve to exist. That child is still inside you, waiting for someone to finally say, "You don't need to do anything to deserve love. You always deserved it." And maybe now, with the consciousness Weber offers, you can be the person who finally says that to them. This isn't empty therapeutic metaphor. It's concrete work to deconstruct conditioning that's been operating for centuries. It's sitting with the discomfort of not producing and not immediately filling that void with more work. It's feeling guilt for resting and not believing that guilt is the voice of truth. It's realizing that when you feel worthless because you're not being useful, you're hearing 16th century Protestantism, not current reality. And slowly, very slowly, creating a different experience in your own body. An experience that you can exist without justifying, you can be without proving. You have dignity that wasn't earned and therefore can't be lost. Weber didn't believe in individual salvation while the structure remains intact. He understood we're products of forces larger than ourselves, but he also believed consciousness is a form of freedom, even when absolute freedom is impossible. When you understand the cage, you're still inside it, but you're no longer mistaking the bars for the horizon. You know there's a difference between what is and what could be. And that knowledge, painful as it is also a source of dignity, because it means you're not just reacting. You're choosing, even within severe limits, and maybe the greatest gift you can give a child isn't complete protection from the iron cage, because that's impossible. Maybe it's consciousness that the cage exists. Language to name what they'll feel when the world says they need to prove their worth. Permission to question what everyone assumes is natural. And above all, embodied memory that they were once loved without having to do anything. And that experience proves unconditional love is possible, even if rare. Are you ready to offer that? Not perfectly, because perfection is another trap of productivity logic, but imperfectly, consciously, with all the compassion you can muster for both the child and yourself? Because if you are, you're participating in one of the deepest forms of resistance that exists in modernity. You're refusing the logic Weber said imprisons us. You're creating a small space where another kind of life is possible. And that, however small, however fragile, is revolutionary. If you've made it this far on this journey through Max Weber's ideas about how we learn to be useful before learning to be loved, you're clearly seeking something deeper than surface-level answers. You're looking for real tools to free yourself from this invisible iron cage that shaped your entire relationship with work, worth, and dignity. This channel exists exactly for that. To explore these invisible structures that govern our psyche, to name the cultural wounds everyone feels but no one talks about, and to find paths, however imperfect, to a life with more awareness and less compulsion. If this resonates with you, subscribe to the channel now. It's not just about racking up content. It's about building a community of people who refuse to accept that life has to be endless productivity. Every week I bring reflections like this, diving into thinkers who deeply understood the traps of modernity. You're not alone in this search for meaning beyond utility. See you in the next video. If you want to go even deeper into how modernity shaped our psyche in ways we don't even notice, you need to watch my video on the disenchantment of the world, according to Max Weber. There I reveal how we lost the ability to experience magic, transcendence, and deep meaning, and why that explains the existential anxiety permeating our era. It's a natural continuation of this conversation, exploring not just how we learned to be useful, but what we lost in the process. You'll understand why, even after achieving everything society promised would bring happiness, you still feel empty. The link is on screen now. Keep seeking meaning. Until the next reflection.